Nice. Okay, so recording is on. All right, so welcome to Wednesday of the 2019 Virtual Residency Workshop. And we're starting today with a panel. So this is an intermediate panel. And intermediate is the code word, meaning we don't know how to teach it. This is a panel on effective communication. And we don't have slides today because we were all entirely too lazy to exercise ourselves to the point of slides. So instead, we have a list of questions that we came up with for ourselves, which is a good way to cheat because then we know that we can answer these questions because we came up with them. Before we start, I want to go ahead and introduce ourselves. And let's start out in TV land with our three remote panelists. So Sandra, why don't you go ahead, say your name, your institution, what time it is where you are, and what your background is with respect to facilitation.
Hello everyone, I'm Sandra Gesing from the University of Notre Dame, and I'm a computational scientist at the Center for Research Computing and a research assistant professor at the Computer Science and Engineering Department. My time zone is in Europe. It's 4 p.m., so very relaxed afternoon time. So before drinking time. So so felicitation. I work a lot with science gateways, and I've done a lot of research myself in distributed computing and computational workflows, and I work a lot with researchers in biology, in physics, in different areas, and more and more also with people in humanities.
Thank you, Sandra. Okay, so Susan, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. I am Susan Miller. I am here in Tucson, Arizona. It is about 7:03 a.m. and I'm with the Data Science Institute here. And I've also been heading up we have a policies and procedures subcommittee, part of our governance committee for the high performance computing facility here. And like Sandra said, we also deal with a lot of biologists, anybody, social science, anybody on campus who's trying to use HPC. And yeah, it's been a pretty good experience.
Thank you, Susan. Zoe, you want to go ahead? And if you're talking, you're muted. I saw somebody before, I'm sure. Hang on. Okay, well, Zoe, we'll come back to you. Dylan, go ahead.
My name is Dylan Perkins. I am the end user support for our Advanced Research Computing Center at the University of Wyoming. I am not a computer scientist. I sort of fell into this job like many of you. I am a geographer. I have an arts degree, but it was mostly just because that's the only thing we offer at our university. So I work an awful lot with, like Susan and Sandra said, with biologists and ecologists, because they're the ones that kind of want to talk about things the engineers don't necessarily want to, but we often have to. And that's kind of what we do there.
All right, and Wallace, go ahead.
Hi everybody, I'm Wallace Chase, and I am with the Research Network in New Zealand. But before that, I was with Clemson University. Before that, I was with Washington State University here in the U.S. My role right now is that I am an engagement manager for RIAM. So I go out and talk with both the IT departments and researchers within institutions that are trying to move big data around or just generally working with big data and helping them to either get their problems resolved from a kind of a national level with the network, or to make sure that there are linkages between the IT department and the researcher and that communication is going well there. In my previous jobs, I've worked as in the IT departments, mostly in the network engineering side of things, and in leadership there. So I've done a lot of on-campus facilitation as well, kind of from that role of the IT department on the enterprise side, trying to figure out what the heck it is actually all these researchers are complaining about.
Okay, and I see a couple of phone numbers have popped up. So if either of you is Zoe, you can dive in, because I think otherwise we've lost Zoe. Zoe, are you on? Any luck on that? Oh dear. Okay. Well, hopefully we'll get her back shortly. But in the meantime, let's go back to go ahead to the questions. And all of these questions are for everyone, and everyone should dive in. And everyone in the audience, both in the room and out in TV land, dive in with your questions at any time. These questions are only meant to get the discussion going. So what are some of the tricks of the trade that you like to use to communicate effectively with researchers? What are your little tricks that you do, your little evil schemes?
I guess I'll get started if nobody online wants to start with it. So I guess one of the tricks that I have to employ frequently is to get to the dang point. Often I'm in meetings with systems people, and we're talking to our researchers, and they get up and start talking about all the infrastructure on the whiteboard and start drawing it around, and you can see the researchers just like leaning back and their eyes getting really big and going like, I don't know what I'm doing here. So the first thing is to kind of redirect the whole meeting. I'm like, all right, what are we here for? And this is what we're here to help you with. So get to the point as fast as possible, but not too fast.
Good, I really like that one. Wallace.
So I would just follow on to yours. That's okay. And I agree with that, especially when you're dealing with the technical people in the room, the IT people in the room. Yeah. With the researchers, though, I like to give them a lot more leeway to talk about what they're doing, so that you get a little more background on their research, get them talking, get them a little more comfortable with the situation. Because often, like what we did yesterday with the groups in here, it's a little intimidating to be sitting there and having a whole group of highly technical people there. You may be the only untechnical person from an IT perspective, trying to explain what's going on. And we as a community of IT people can be a little intense sometimes because we know our discipline very well, and then you just burrow down into things. So it is very good to keep the technical people kind of pulled back and make sure that they're not just zeroing in on things too much, and keep the researcher talking, keep them going to try to understand the whole workflow. Because often you'll find out that what they think is their problem may not be their problem, or they may have multiple things going on that even if you fix the one, you haven't actually fixed what's actually happening.
So I think that's a really excellent point, and I think something that happens very often is a researcher will construct a solution based on their own background, but when they come to you, you may be in a position to point out other solutions that provide better value for them that wouldn't have occurred to them because they wouldn't have the background around those other solutions.
So how many people in here, especially who are IT people, have ever had a researcher come to you with a solution already? How many times has that necessarily been the right technical solution in your mindset to do what they want to do at the end? Sometimes.
Less than 50%.
But I can remember back several years ago when every single researcher over the sun came to me and said, I was told I need this SDN thing to solve all my problems. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe
Probably
you do,
not.
maybe you don't. Yeah. Okay, and I see that Zoe is able to join us. So Zoe, do you want to quickly introduce yourself and tell us what time zone you're in, and give just a little bit of background?
I am Zoe Braderman. I'm an independent.
I'm going to need you to shout much louder because we're not picking you up, unfortunately.
My name is Zoe Braderman. I'm on the Eastern time zone, and I'm an independent consultant.
Do what? Yeah, that may be. Zoe, so it might be that your mic level needs to go up a bit, the gain level on it. In the meantime, throwing this question open to the remote folks as well. So tricks of the trade. So any of Zoe or Sandra or Susan want to dive in and talk about tricks of the trade that you like to use?
first of all, I would like to second the first two ones. Yes, this is really good advice, I think. And the other thing I always do, I meet first with the researcher alone before I meet with all the team. And I look always at the last publications they had and ask them, oh, I've seen this. What is this about? What is, to get them talking. And they feel very comfortable and they feel a little bit, let's say, also nice about that I know their publication. So it's a good starting point.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because you're communicating a really valuable message, which is I actually care about your research, unlike everybody else you meet outside of your own little research community.
You have to realize that this has been their world potentially for their entire academic career, is
Right.
this particular, they're all in on this. So if you show interest in that and show that you've done a little bit of homework yourself, it means the world.
Yep. Okay, Susan or Zoe, want to dive in?
Well, I can add a couple of things. I like what's been said so far, but I think too, trying to communicate with them in terms of something they're already familiar with, put it in terms, I think, Henry, when you did your tour, at least last time, you were saying this is really just like a rack full of PCs. So it's something they can relate to. And then using anecdotes, telling them, we worked with this other researcher and they were running a desktop application and it ran for a week and a half and nobody could use their computer. We put it on HPC and it was done in 4 minutes. Things like that. Something that is easy for them to grasp.
Yeah, I confess when I do that, and I like using that technique, I always put in the disclaimer, not that we can guarantee that amount of speed up for you, because they will come after me if they can't at least meet what the best case we've ever had can do. All right, Zoe, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, first, can you hear me?
I'm going to try and turn this one up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's very hard to hear you, unfortunately.
Uh-oh.
So shout at your loudest shout.
Okay.
That's good, much better.
Okay. So yeah, I think basically just give them examples of success stories from other. I also think they benefit from realizing, like, any confirmation that is how HPC works, how systems work, how the technology works, not them. I feel like they ease up a little bit. And yeah, just in general, start with,
Yeah, she calls them.
Yeah. So Zoe, can you do us a favor? Can you switch your audio to telephone? Because we think that'll work great.
Sure.
Okay, so what I'm going to do in the meantime is we'll move to the next question. By the way, we sort of threw these together. They're in somewhat random order, and we're not going to cover all of them because the first one took 15 minutes. But we got a lot of good value out of the 15 minutes. So what kinds of ideas, concepts, technologies, techniques, etc., whatever it is, do you find are the most challenging to communicate or to explain? What do you do about that? What's hard to explain?
I can start again, I guess.
Yeah, go ahead, Dylan.
The scheduler is the hardest thing for me to explain to somebody else. First, if they're a new user, then they have no idea. If they're logged into a computer, they should be able to use it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So getting that past that, then the more advanced users, the hardest part about the scheduler thing is that what resources do they need to schedule? And what does their data need? What does their model need? And oftentimes I don't know. And that's kind of the hard part. And it's just kind of a back and forth with the researcher to try to figure it out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And so I have an analogy for schedulers, but the problem is that that analogy doesn't help if they don't understand what the cluster actually is, yes. That it's a pile of PCs and a network that hooks them together. And if they don't understand that aspect, and to first order, none of the new ones do, because where would they ever have encountered that? That doesn't help. And that's why I was saying on Sunday that the people who've taken the tour do understand, and the people who haven't taken the tour don't understand. And it simply comes down to, do they really get that there's a pile of servers? Do they really get that there's a pile of computers and they have to use some of them? And then the next question is, do they get that there are hundreds of other people trying to use them at the same time? So the analogy I use is, you know, you're at the sporting event and you want to get the hot dog and you have to go stand in line, and there might be like 6 different lines and each one has a cashier getting hot dogs and ringing you up. But you can't all dive at the cashier at the same time. Now, at home, you don't have to stand in line with your own kitchen, but there's a much bigger limit to what you can do in your kitchen at home. So that sort of analogy works great if they've been on the tour. That's a great point. Okay, who else?
So for me, and being in networking, it's about big data. What is big data to somebody is very relative to their situation. So if you've got a researcher who hasn't dealt with big data before a lot, doesn't know a lot about data movement, data storage, data management, that sort of thing, big data may be a couple gig file. But if you go and you talk to the senior engineers at the research network, big data for them is somebody trying to move terabytes of information around. A couple gigs is not big data, is not of concern there. So it really is relative as to who you are, what your level of familiarity is with the field, and what kind of IT support you have. If you're on a cruddy laptop, on a cruddy wireless connection, big data is just about everything. And explaining those differences both within IT, within the computing community, and to the researcher, and making sure that everybody understands that can be challenging at times.
Good. Who's next?
Yeah, I think the challenging fact is often that I don't know how much they know. So I have to find out what I can say, which terms I can use. And I start always at a very low level and maybe only ask, oh, do you use cloud maybe for your photographs, or, or even in your research already? Or do you use something like, something bigger than your PC? And then I go from there. It's more about listening to them, how they talk about technology, than me to start with technology. So that is so. And with, for example, science gateways, at the beginning, I never say science gateways, but I say something, oh, we could provide a solution in your web browser. And everyone knows what a web browser is. And then after a while, when they feel comfortable, then I tell them, oh, you use, by the way, now a science gateway.
Right. I think that's a great point. Okay, Zoe or Susan, you want to add into this?
Well, one thing that I find commonly is it's hard for people to understand the difference between shared memory and distributed memory, and it doesn't help that we have confusing things like OpenMP versus MPI, and they have no idea what any of that is or how it works. So maybe providing some diagrams, some tutorials, some simple examples, but that's always a challenge for us.
So just out of curiosity, how many of you have faced this situation? The user uses the term OpenMPI, and then you have to figure out whether they meant OpenMP or a specific implementation of MPI or just MPI in general. How many of you have had, okay, so the OpenMPI folks, I love them and I love OpenMPI, but on the other hand, they ought to be ashamed of themselves. So, Zoe, do you got one you want to throw in here? And I see you've got the phone hookup now.
Yeah,
Oh, that's so good. Oh, Zoe, that is perfect. Please go ahead.
great, awesome. Yeah, so I completely, agree about, do they necessarily mean the same thing, and how do you clarify that they mean what they're saying, and how do you do it while not hurting their feelings, but also making sure to get that information before anything else moves forward based on falsity. So honestly, that's a question that recently came up that I don't know the answer to. So I'm really glad that came up.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and also, pretty much what everyone else said so far on that one. And also, the sequence of a conversation matters.
Yeah.
So, and also incorporating humor also just really helps in terms of their active listening on their part, and then everything just goes smoothly. As absurd and minuscule as that seems, I feel like you can't undervalue that.
Well, and I think that's a really important point. And if you zoom out a little bit, I think there's a more general point, which is that if you're not connecting with them emotionally in some way, then the whole intellectual part of it, for most of the folks, at least in my experience, the intellectual part does not occur if you don't get the emotional connection in some way before that. I think you also raised a really good point about the order in which you present things. And this is a teaching thing that I've seen again and again and again. And there are a lot of subjects where it's just impossible to say where you should start, because no matter where you start, it depends on some other thing that you need to teach them first. And the only technique I've ever figured out for that is you give them a précis, and then you give them a slightly bigger précis, and you sort of make it bigger and bigger till eventually you get to the point where you can start actually explaining the individual things that are all mutually interdependent. Dana?
Just one point, like, use simpler words for things.
Yes.
So, like, summary instead of précis.
I like the word précis.
As an example.
That's a good word.
Wise ass. All right. Yes, Dave.
One of the things I find is to have them show you exactly what their workflow is to start out with, whether that's on a laptop or you got a server, and then I can extrapolate what parts need to be transposed to bring up.
Right. Yeah, have them walk you through their workflow that they currently have to figure out how to translate it to the new environment. Yeah, I think that's a real good point. Right. Carla.
Yeah, one of the issues that I run into, particularly with grad students, is they come with me and they say, what should my workflow be? And I'm like, I don't do the research. And they're like, well, my PI told me that you would tell me what to do.
We had a case one time where we got a tear-stained phone call from a grad student because the grad student knew nothing at all about programming, and their advisor had handed them the name of a standard code and a paper and said, add this to that code. So it was not that they didn't know that programming language. They had zero programming experience. And we actually were able to help the student. It was during this workshop several years ago. And we were holding an evening lab session. And we said, okay, come in the evening and we'll be here and we'll see what we can do to help. And over the course of about an hour, we're able to actually help with that. And get the student productive. But what the advisor had asked them to do was laughably
And what I usually do is like, I can't help you on this, but I can show you how to use the Linux command line. I can show you how to submit a very simple job. And I'm getting you this information, and then they can research the other end of things.
Right. And of course, that leads to the usual question of, will you write my code for me?
Yes.
How many of you have been asked to write code for someone? Okay. How many of you made the mistake the first time of saying yes? Okay. I devoted an entire semester, not all day every day, but an entire semester to helping, which effectively meant writing the code for this person. And at the end of the semester, they dropped out of grad school. And that was when I learned my lesson. You don't write the code for them. You help them learn to write the code. Yeah. Okay.
Henry, there are questions from TV Land.
Yeah, please. Let me turn on the chat here. It was a postdoc who was about to leave the country in 2 days. That's perfect. How about users who've never used Linux command line interface? This is one of my biggest challenges. Okay, so what do folks do about that? And that's not just for the panelists, folks in the room or out in TV land. What do you do when someone comes to you and they have no background in Linux and or command line?
How they normally interact. So, for example, if I'm asking them to list the contents of the directory, I try to draw an analogy to how they are opening up a window on the documents folder and looking at it. So something in terms that they can understand, especially when explaining the file path. I first have them muck around with the directory and the contents, create some files, and then draw them back to an environment they are familiar with, and then talk back to it.
Right.
So give them a visual confirmation.
Carla.
I created a 6-hour Linux crash course to take somebody from no experience to compiling programs. And if they can't actually attend the course, I give them my notes. And I say, if there's something you don't understand, let me know and I'll rewrite the notes.
Good. I shortened it even more than that. I have, it's typically about a 1-hour exercise, and it's written out very step by step. And the idea is for them to practice commands like pwd and ls, right? Because so much of what they're going to need to do, at least initially, is just the very basic commands. And it's got descriptions of what these things mean, and it reflects back to, I confess, because my background is much more Windows than Mac OS, it reflects back to Windows analogies. It's like double clicking on a folder, right? That sort of thing. Yes, Jim.
The software carpentry, 3-hour half day, that material is very good.
Right. Software carpentry is really helpful for that.
And somebody who comes in, I basically have them sit down next to me, and we, without looking at it, I just start plowing through like I'm doing a software carpentry, just at a quicker pace.
Right. Jason.
I mean, it is antithetical to a lot of us who regularly use Linux and are familiar with it. We sort of, I think, can be very zealous about insisting that, command line interface is the way to go. It's so much more efficient. You can,
We're Linux bigots.
That is true.
Yeah.
That is true in a number of cases, but I really still think that we need to consider who we might be excluding there, because if, as you say, you have about an hour to get someone hooked, you're not going to make them even comfortable navigating through a command interface in an hour. And so that's where we need to think about and put effort into things like science gateways or other gateways that can at least simplify a little bit the process of submitting jobs, finding results, doing this kind of thing. We need not say, this is an intractable barrier and we're refusing to do anything about it, and you either take the time to do this or you're out of luck. I really think we need to try to meet them halfway at least. Now that said, there are things like software carpentry. DataCamp has a really excellent tutorial on Shell and stuff like that. They're out there, but we really do need to try to find ways to mitigate that a little bit, especially as it's going to become more agnostic where computations happen. So there's things about bursting to the cloud, all this kind of stuff. They're maybe not going to be submitting a job to a local system only. We need an interface that abstracts that a little bit from them.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Two minds about making it easier for them to use it. One, I do want to make it easier for them to use it since it makes my job easier. But if they are using the command line, even if it's just a circumspect introduction, they still do learn the system underneath, which in the end, if they are running some computation down the line, would help them optimize their code even more than it's just a point of click. So I do not force them to use the command line, but I do want to give them an introduction so that they learn the system underneath, so that if an error comes out in the future, they are not completely lost in a point of click.
Yeah, Dana.
I think that's an important conversation to have, because it's like, I immediately thought of my car, right?
Yeah.
No one wants me to have an introduction to how the engine works, but I'm allowed to drive it. I don't researchers especially, I think, you know, saying, oh, you should know this because it's interesting to me, we have to be really careful about approaching that, I think, because they want to do their science or whatever their field is. And so, you know, you can sneak in the stuff underneath that you know will help them understand, but you have to be very sneaky about it.
Yes, putting vegetables in the cupcakes.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
it also,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Sandra.
and it also depends a little bit on the level what they really need to solve. So I know, for example, that I work with a couple of faculties who would be never interested to learn Linux, but they want to understand the tools which are available, where the science gateways often come in. But their PhD students often are very interested to find out how they could start the tools themselves. And then it's nice to point them to, for example, Linux training we have also at Notre Dame at the center.
Right. Actually, I'm going to turn that off because of the, okay, so we lecture for various classes and offer workshops which include command line interface. Okay, so that's, should we use raise hand in TV land now? Just someone will yell at me when you need to. Okay, we have 2 intro to Linux workshops per semester and post slides online. So I have this picture in my head of something I'd like to do, and I haven't had time to do it, and I'm wondering if I might end up with time this summer. I'd like to record a bunch of little like 5-minute videos, 1 Linux command per video, and not a deep dive into it either, right? A separate video for ls, and then another video for ls-l, and then still an additional video for ls-ltr, right? Just little tiny morsels that people can go look up and say, okay, so now I can learn that one little thing without having to have a tutorial about it. I can do it in bite-sized chunks. Yeah.
I just use YouTube and Google. So YouTube have those videos, maybe not segmented like that. Maybe it's like a half-hour video of basic concepts. But that's literally what I use.
Yeah.
Okay. And then when I need,
You mean to learn it yourself, or you direct users there?
Well, that's what I need to learn it myself.
Okay.
To chime in a little bit on that one, I find that a lot of students don't like to watch a half-hour video at all. Like you said, the 5-minute ones. And I've already started the same sort of program that you're talking about. The first one I made was how to log into from Windows. So you get the SSH client. That's all it was. Just how to download the SSH client.
And that's already a big deal because for many of them, okay, so because I teach programming for non-majors, and because I make them write a half-page essay for every programming project they do, I actually have some insight into how they think when they're new to this. And for example, they think that PuTTY is an important thing in and of itself, and they refer to, I ran it on PuTTY. Which tells me they fundamentally do not understand the notion of connecting to a remote machine. Now, some semesters I've had the presence of mind to send an email where I use an analogy like trying to run a robot remotely via a web browser. The web browser is not the robot. It's just the interface to get to the robot. But it's very hard to explain to them. It typically takes an entire semester before they get the idea that PuTTY is just the software that connects them to the other machine, not PuTTY is the other machine. Josh?
I use email for that purpose.
Yeah.
Can I say something?
Please do.
I taught a Linux class at my university for 4 days last week, and what I found worked is that they got a chance to practice a lot of different commands. I made them practice commands. But another thing that would be good, I'm an ex-Solaris guy, and I know when you opened up man pages on Solaris, when you scrolled all the way to the end of the man page, there were always examples. That's not always the case in Linux.
Right.
Not always examples. So I was, to an extent, I was thinking about rebuilding a lot of those man pages, the most common ones, and putting examples in the man pages where when a person uses the command or doesn't know how, they can go to the man page, they can scroll to the end, and they can see examples on how to use them.
Yeah, I think the examples point is a really good one, and you're absolutely correct. In my experience, most Linux manual pages do not show examples, or very, very limited. Yeah.
Hoping that technically Windows has SSH now.
Yeah.
You still need to manually enable it, so it's not as point and click. And now WSL is getting more and more features. So I'm hoping somewhere down the line, like a year and a half, that mindset will change slightly when when SSH comes as a default feature in Windows. Right. They just open up command line.
It's in there now.
You need to just manually enable it.
No, it's there. In the most recent version.
Yeah, it depends on whether you've updated to the latest build.
Windows 10.
No, I know, but it's not enabled by default. It is.
So to first order, even if it is enabled by default, the difficulty is they've never heard of it. So it makes no difference. Enabling it is the least of your worries. It's, okay, there's this thing you can open from the start window that then opens up a window that looks completely foreign to you, that you've never seen anything like that in your whole life. And then you type something, which I know you never do when you open up a window, but you're going to type something, and then weird magic will happen, and now you're on the supercomputer. That's the hard part. Whether it's on or off by default, that's a minor detail. There's a thing to open up that you then type stuff. That's hard, right? And the conceptual understanding. So math educators have this wonderful concept called the mental number line, right? So can you picture in your head the difference between 12 and -7, right? Does that resonate for you, or is it just a bunch of numbers? And we face the same thing, the computational number line. And most of our users don't have what we would think of as a computational number line in our head. What they have in their head is their phone, right? That's a computer to them, maybe a laptop. And so you've got a whole conceptual foundation that you have to build with them. That doesn't happen in the first hour. But of course, in the first hour, they got to be productive. Okay, let's see what else came from TV land. Hang on. We implemented Open on Demand, so that's a partial solution for us. Yeah, we've just started down that road. We have a, let's call it pre-production version of Open on Demand. We're just starting to look for users to get on there. We have high hopes that that will help for a number of them, but we're not there yet. We've implemented some science gateways, so we have WebMO, we have Galaxy, and then of course we have Fluent sort of comes with its own gateway structure. There's one or two, MATLAB, but we're just starting down that road. And of course, each of those has its own quirks that we have to learn alongside the researchers. Okay, VNC Desktop, MATLAB, SAS, yeah, Jupyter Notebooks. Happily, Open on Demand has support for that directly built in, so we're expecting to see some uptake there. Yeah, I helped them install Xming on Windows and Xquartz on Macs to have the drag and drop Windows experience and use GUI instead of command line to use software on the Linux box. That's a very interesting approach. I haven't tried that. I know we've had a little bit of Xming that we've exposed users to, but in a very limited way. Has anybody used similar kinds of techniques at their own institution?
I'm using Xming.
Okay. You personally, or you're teaching your users?
Some users, when they ask, like, if they come from Linux, I think they have an X11 thingy by default. Yeah. Yeah, so Windows people don't, and I don't think Mac does either. So
yeah, although I will say very few of our users come from a Linux background.
Sure.
They're
some of our departmental computers are on Linux. So.
Right. Yeah, and that's true for us too, but most of them don't use those.
Yeah, the Windows one that we have, so I figured
right.
out for myself.
And I mean, you can show someone how to bring up a terminal window in Mac OS. That's not the problem. It's the fact that they've never done that in their life, right? And you had a comment as well.
Henry, let me just shortly yell at you. There's a comment. Could you summarize the audience comments Some are hard to hear.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yes. And by the way, people in the audience scream bloody murder. And then I will also say back to you what you just said. Go ahead.
So I think the problem with a lot of these XO softwares like Xwing and Xbox, the last update was in 2016. So on the later Mac OSs, we have a lot of problems with users who want to run GUI applications or visualization software because it sometimes just breaks due to OpenGL library issues. And Xwing, the paid version is the latest, and the free version is usually a year or two behind this time. So we have a lot of hardware issues with that, but we are trying to find ways to.
Yeah, so this is one of the difficulties with a lot of these free software packages. If there isn't a very active development community out there, then they can stall in their development, and meanwhile the OSs drift away and they're no longer very effective. Jason? Not super responsive. That's a general problem with X Windows in my experience. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, I mean, I get that it's more complicated than this, but I do find myself with exactly this kind of situation thinking, it's 2019, why haven't we solved this yet? So one decent example of that is like if you have the MP version of Status, so that's the version of Status that can take advantage of multi-cores and usually is run on clusters and stuff like that. If you have something functional like Xport or Xwing or whatever, you can launch it from the command line and it will pop up on your desktop as if it's a local desktop application. And so then the economists and people who are using Stata are very happy because it looks like exactly what they're used to using on their local desktop. And the barrier to entry there is zero. But if you can't get these things working, or if the instructions to do so are this long and you don't necessarily have time to work on this one person's desktop to try to troubleshoot exporting.
And I think that's
a huge problem.
Okay, so summarizing, the difficulty is that if they can't very straightforwardly pop up the X window on their Windows or Mac desktop, they're going to punt, or you're going to have to sit with them and show them. And I agree with that absolutely, and I think that actually answers your original question. How is it possible that in 2019 we haven't solved this problem? Because, huh?
Yeah, but so there's also another problem here. That's we haven't solved X, and that should have been fixed, John, a long time ago.
Yeah, so X Windows itself is difficult, and that's created a lot of problems. If anybody has a universal solution to this problem, I'd love to see it. But every time I turn around, we're encountering this exact same problem again with different technologies and new user communities, and it's still just as messed up as it was 30 years ago. Good, and I don't want to go too far down one technology rabbit hole here, but I do believe that people need to learn to use the command line if they expect to do significant work on supercomputers. So I agree and I disagree. So the overwhelming majority of our users are using canned software. They're using, almost always, it's free open source packages developed by someone somewhere around the world who is in a related research community. And what we know, and there have been, whole workshops devoted to this issue and whole organizations devoted to this issue, the federal research funding agencies do not want to pay good money to make the software easy to use. They are spending their money on groovy new science, and anything that does not come under the heading of groovy new science, they don't consider to be part of their mission, and they're not going to pay for it. The software remains really hard to use. If anything, it's getting harder to use. Science gateways have been very helpful for some of the most popular application areas, but we always have that sort of 50-50 bifurcation that half of our users use very few very popular codes, and the other half of our users use hundreds of different codes, and we have to be able to serve both halves. So when we can steer somebody to something easier, we do, but often we can't. About half the time. It was SC 11 or 12 or something. Dan Stanzione, the director of the Texas Advanced Computing Center, was giving a talk at an event, and he said, and this stuck with me, and it's still true apparently, he said, half of our usage is 40 codes. And there's a lot we can do to help those folks. And the other half of our usage is 4,000 codes. And there's not a damn thing we can do for them. Now, I don't agree with that last part completely. There are things we can do, and that's actually our role. But it is 4,000 codes. Here at OU, with a much smaller user base, it's 400. That number will get bigger, not smaller. Particularly, how many of you have noticed the bioscience folks, they don't run a code, they run 20 codes. And they'd like you to install another 30 so that they can see what those 30 do and whether they will be useful. And your labor cost for installing those 30 codes is 30 times higher than your labor cost for installing the one code for that engineer, on top of which they may run it once and decide it's not useful, and they have no way of knowing whether it's useful until you've installed it.
But
Jerry.
Your labor cost of allowing them to try and install it and come to you with questions repeatedly is also much higher
Yes,
than just installing it for them.
Right. So this is a very difficult tension, is do you install it for them? Do you have them install it themselves? Do you teach them to install it? Because each one of those has a very high labor cost associated with it.
If I could summarize just
Yeah,
a little
Dylan, go ahead.
bit. The question was, how do we get users, researchers, since this is the panel on effective communication, I used to using a Linux command line, and the answer, what I'm hearing, is that there's lots of different ways.
Yes.
And it's up to debate with us internally, but what we need to do is present them with what we think is going to be best for them.
Right, and that's an assessment, that's a judgment call. You have to listen to what it is they're trying to accomplish and then try and figure out what's going to be the best mechanism to get that to work. Okay.
Can I make a comment? This is Anita
Yeah,
Short.
please go ahead, Anita.
I've been hearing a number of things, and I think we're all faced with those same challenges. That fine line between insulting somebody and the fine line between you should really at least understand your own science about what you're doing, so you can give us some basic information to help you decide what might be the tools that you should use to accomplish this. We have generally come to terms with the fact that we try not to spend too much time trying to show people interactively how to do things with Xming and things like that, because in the long run, we want them to understand for their workflow, in order to have that hands-off approach, to be able to submit something, have it do what they need to do, and come back and either do that post-processing or pre-processing. It's hard to put a workflow together like that if you're asking them to do something interactive that seems natural to them. Now, with that said, we haven't done something like Open on Demand, or we haven't set up Jupyter Notebooks, or we haven't done something like that, which I know people are doing, and we've looked at that. Some of our biggest users are MATLAB users, and that doesn't make any sense to try to show them how to do what they feel looks comfortable in MATLAB in a GUI environment, because of the lags and because of the dependency on their connectivity in order to be able to get that to work, versus using a batch submit, and to be able to get them to understand that they could do multiple jobs at the same time on the cluster, not just that single job submission from their desktop. So, I listen to all of these things, and, the last summary is probably the best, and that is, we probably don't have a good solution unless everybody starts moving towards this concept of using a web interface, which it seems like a lot of people want that to submit their jobs. But even doing something like that, we found when we tried to do something such as Gaussian, we tried to set up some type of front-end web interface, they still have to understand the basic concepts of using the software, the input files, the structure of the input files, how that works, what they expect the memory to be for that job, how long that job, should it use X number of cores. So there's so much involved that, it seems like, okay, do we separate that and focus on that part? And then basically handhold them in the submission and building the job scripts to get them to work right. That's kind of what I would pose to the audience at this point, that, where is our best time served? Because I've listened to several people say, oh, I've sat down and spent this amount of time working with an individual. And the problem with that is it doesn't scale. Like, we have one person to do support. And I've heard a lot of people talk about that as well. That doesn't scale. And even when you do a course, the timing necessarily isn't right for a research group to say, oh, I've got 6 grad students that really need to be trained right now. So we've learned that it seems custom courses or requests for that, and trying to ask them to get a couple people together seems to allow that to scale more. So kind of that's my section to say, you know, I wish there was a good solution, but with the number of people that we have to support, it doesn't make it very cost effective to spend certain time trying to get them on board rather than just kind of biting the bullet and, you know, giving them tools to be able to do what they need.
Thank you, Anita. Jerry.
That ends up being a balancing act. You have to determine where you're going to get the bang for your buck from bringing on a new user, bringing them up to speed, even when it's not obvious initially that they're going to be able to pick it up very quickly. Because you might be, you have to figure out if they are by chance the index user for their group who can go back and then communicate to their group. One of the things I found in the past is setting up a class. We set it up, we advertised it literally for months so that the team could figure out what they needed, who they needed to send, and we could plan it on our time, because the last group I was in was a small group. We didn't have a lot of people. You've got one person for support. We had 3 part-time people trying to support everybody. You did mention Jupyter Notebooks. I think I need to point out that setting up a Jupyter Hub and populating it with a few test notebooks is both quick and easy and very, very prudent. So I would recommend in your case that you consider doing that. That's the sort of thing that we found actually worked very well. I found that again recently. I set that up and request went from relatively high for Python, for Anaconda especially, down to just about 0. So there's some benefit to looking at things like that.
And by the way, I want to point out that in the first 53 minutes of this, we've gotten through 2 of our questions, and there were 54 new messages on the chat. So I think once upon a time, I had a boss who about every 6 months would just send out an email saying, I've deleted all my emails, so if you sent me something, send it again. So I feel like we can't possibly go any deeper in this without committing the rest of our time for the day. So I'm going to insist that we go on to question number 3 and see if in the last 20 minutes we can answer question number 3. How do you follow up after the conversation, and how can that follow-up act as a check for understanding from all parties?
I have 2, I separate into 2 things. Well, one is during the conversation, follow-up needs to happen. And has anybody used active listening or know kind of the emotional techniques behind active listening? Yeah, cool, awesome. So
can you take a moment and give us a very quick précis of what that means?
So it's you shut up and you look at their eye, you look in their face, and you let them talk their way through things. Now sometimes they'll stumble, but they'll maybe be able to talk their way out of it. And you're giving good visual feedback with your, nodding and like your understanding. At the end of their point, you can either ask clarifying questions, or at the end of that you go, this is what I heard. Tell me if that's right. And that's when I start taking notes. I don't take notes while they're talking to me. One, it kind of builds that emotional connection. And then also follow up after conversation too, with this is what we got done or whatever.
Yeah, I would say the follow-up for me is incredibly important, to summarize after we've had the conversation, after we've walked away, to try to immediately, and this comes into managing your time, to make sure that after you have a meeting with somebody, you give yourself time immediately after that to do this. In my opinion, that works best for me. To write up in an email or write up in some sort of communication back to that person, hey, here's what we went over, here's the action points that, all good things from moved over into here. That here's what I understood, here's what the problems are, here's the action items, and here's the different folks that are going to take those different action items for that. And then hopefully you get a response back. If you don't get a response back, then they can get a response back that yes, that is what needs to happen or stuff. I find that incredibly important, but it's very easy in our very, very busy lives to go from one meeting to another, and then 2 days later try to do that. You're not going to be very successful in it. So I always try to make sure that I have 10 or 15 minutes, and that I make it a point to do that immediately after I have that conversation. Otherwise, it's almost useless.
Good. Remote panelists, any thoughts on this? How to do follow-up?
I think the more questions you ask of them afterward, the better. Just to really, confirm that you're on the same page while it's kind of in a neutral state rather than during the conversation again.
Good.
So kind of ask them questions too. So not only ask them if they have any further questions, but sometimes ask them questions, kind of subtly confirming any possible miscommunications that one might not know are existing miscommunications.
Yeah, I agree. And it is very, very easy to misunderstand someone from another discipline. Good. Susan or Sandra, you want to make any comments on this?
Sure. I think following on to what Zoe was just saying, making sure that they don't get frustrated, that they understand it takes time to learn new things. And if they didn't get it the first time, it's not because they're dumb or they're not trying. It's just an ongoing process that we're there to follow up with them and make sure they don't get stuck.
Yeah, and I wanted to add on one thing. It also depends on the situation, whether they also learn something new or whether we first have to deliver something, that they always get in the loop what happens, or just ask them, we talked about these action items, this is still, all fine for you. So maybe really in a period of always 2 weeks or something, or every 3 weeks, dependent on the project, of course.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Wow, we actually got that one polished off. Okay, so this was one of my questions. Who are the speakers or writers who you find to be most effective at communicating? They don't have to be in STEM. These could be, can be your favorite fiction writer. If you want to talk about someone who created a video game that you find is very good at communicating, whatever you want, doesn't matter who it is, but what approaches of theirs do you like? What do you steal from them?
I'm going to start with a brief life story and then tell you why.
Okay.
After I finished my undergrad, I was part of a group of up-and-coming stand-up comedians on the Front Range. So we're all getting together, writing, and doing open mics and all that stuff. But me living in Wyoming, I didn't get to perform as often as they did. They were doing like stand-up 6 nights a week, and they got better at it. I got to go once a month, but my writing got good. But what happened with my writing is I ended up falling into this rule of 3 situation. Does anybody know what the rule of 3 is? Okay, it's a writing technique, which is it's the shortest number of points to make a pattern in your brain. So they call it like the most humorous, satisfying, or most effective way of communicating ideas. So, for example, like just do it. 3 words. Henry is always going, who agrees, who disagrees, who's reserving judgment. So if you don't know what you're doing, sometimes you're doing it anyway. So what I try to do in a meeting with a researcher is I will either have 3 summarized points, and I can expand on each one of those, or I'll have 3 takeaways or action items. And those are the things that I start with, and then I go back for more feedback or back and forth. So the rule of 3, make sure I have 3 well summarized points that I can expand upon each.
So for me, it's the use of analogies or examples. So I'm one of these people who learns very well by an example. The example earlier that given about the man pages and the code at the end, that's exactly where I would go. I wouldn't even read the rest of the stuff. I just go and want to see the example at the end. So for me, that's that's very important. That's very valid. And as you can see, when I do presentations, I tend to use a lot of that. I try to bring it into something that people are aware of, who know about in their day-to-day life, and try to present how that correlates to that.
Good. Sandra and Zoe and Susan?
Yeah, so I learned this from a salesperson, by the way. And he told me, Sandra, if you want to understand something and what he needs, you have to listen and not to talk. And that was an advice I always follow, that it's like, yes, that's a good thing to let them talk at the beginning and to try to understand that it's a technique. Yeah.
Thanks, Sandra. Susan or Zoe?
Zoe, well, one example I can think of offhand is you, Henry, because you're able to really address the people, and you know, listening well. I mean, anyone who really probably does at least 70% listening in general, which, you know, allows for continued information gathering toward, you know, feeding it back.
Good. And Susan?
Yeah, I think this is actually a really important topic because it's easy for people in science to gloss over the soft skills, and those are super important to be able to, as everyone's been saying, listen and communicate, make sure you understand. And I also wanted to mention one of my favorite writers. His name is Matt Ridley. He's a science writer, and he's written a book called Genome, where he does this brilliant thing of breaking down the human genome. Each chapter is a chromosome, and he talks about the letters on the page, how they form words and sentences, and makes analogies to the proteins. So just like that ability to break something down into simple terms is really great.
So for me, I've got two, and they're both writers, Mark Twain and Kurt Vonnegut. Mark Twain, because he repurposes words and uses them for new things, but you can immediately tell what he's getting at. And the one that sticks in my mind is he referred to someone as lying extravagantly. Now, normally we use the word extravagant to mean overspending money. But as soon as I heard that phrase, lying extravagantly, even though it was a completely different use of the word extravagantly from what I would expect, I instantly understood what he meant. And so I look for opportunities to repurpose words into a new situation where, on the one hand, the fact that it's in a new situation makes you notice it, but on the other hand, you can instantly tell what I'm getting at. And then the other one is Kurt Vonnegut. And the reason I really like Kurt Vonnegut is because he does this thing where he explains things to you as if you had just arrived from another planet. And while that's kind of fun and funny and so on, it really makes you rethink all of your assumptions about something when someone explains those assumptions back to you by pretending you don't know that stuff. And so when I can, I try and find ways to re-explain a thing. And I like to use the technique of as if the person I'm talking to was 12. Now, the problem with that is you have to be super careful, because when you talk to someone as if they're 12, there's two pieces to that. There's the information piece, and that's good. And there's the emotion piece, and that's condescending. And I don't know about you. Okay, so how many of you enjoy being condescended to? Oh, what a surprisingly low number of hands have gone up, right? So you have to repackage that so that you're disguising the fact that you're explaining it to them as if they were 12. And so this gets me back to my little phrase about assume everyone is an idiot, treat everyone like a genius. That is, you have to explain it to them as if they understand nothing at the beginning of the explanation, but you have to act as if it's the genius thing to not understand any of this. You have to approach them as if they were Einstein. And getting that balance takes some practice. So that was my one. And we're doing really good. We've gotten now through Is it 3 questions or 4? We've got through 4 questions. Yeah, please, go ahead. Yeah.
I think another really important place where we can learn about communication is from topics that we are not familiar with, because these are radio people who are trying to explain to a wide audience about topics that they're not really familiar with.
Right.
So they have nice techniques to convey their concept and stay relevant.
Right. So the other thing that I learned from the guy in the office next door to mine when I started grad school was, when you give a talk, be very open and candid about your own failures and foolishness, not because you want people to think you're a foolish failure, but because when you admit you don't know a thing, when you are honest and candid, well, nobody else is doing that. So it's incredibly disarming. And they're on your side because you're open about stuff. Yeah, that's right. So I love that technique, just right up front. You saw me doing this Sunday, right? When we started this thing, I was curled up in a ball on the couch, which is a totally true story. But what it's actually intended to convey is, I'm not trying to be the sage on the stage. I'm part of a community that we are building together. Okay, so you enter conversations where there are preconceived notions. What techniques do you use to move beyond these preconceptions?
So I guess when I started out being the support person, I often had my own preconceived notions when I go to meet with researchers, especially ones that are kind of big wigs and bringing millions of dollars to the university, and I get in there and get intimidated by their intelligence. So I guess the technique I would have is confidence that you're the right person for the job. Just go in there knowing that this is what your job is, and you can only learn from these people.
So for me, there's 2 sides to this. There's your preconceptions and there's their preconceptions. So coming out of central IT department and starting down this road of helping and working with researchers, that definitely works 2 ways. So I would get often sent out in the early parts of my career to deal with the most difficult cases out there, because for whatever reason I was a network engineer who could talk to people and I didn't piss them off. So I would go out with all these warnings of, well, Professor X, he's terrible, he's a pain in the butt, he's always breaking things, he hates us, he hates IT, he hates all these things. You go out there and you have to go in and just kind of drop all of that and start that relationship fresh, like you didn't hear any of those things. I would prefer not to have heard any of those things if possible, because you find out often that this person is legitimately upset, has been treated poorly in the past, or just isn't feeling understood, or is frustrated, and it's coming out in these ways. And oftentimes, looking around at your coworkers within central IT, you could understand why they were upset with the level of support they were getting sometimes. On the other hand, you have researchers and scientists and that who view us as a community sometimes as IT. Mm-hmm. So we are the IT department. How many people in here work for the IT department directly? Okay, so you are IT, and initially you are no different than the help desk person that pissed them off 2 years ago, when they said it was, when they said, oh, it's your computer, it's not the network. How many times have you heard that? Oh, it must be your machine, it's not the network. Well, 99% of the time that's correct, but you should never tell that to a person because it's the wrong thing to say. So you have to realize that there are those preconceived notions in both ways, and you have to actively let those go on your side. And then you have to just realize they're going to exist on the other side. Maybe sit there and take a beating for a little while on how central IT sucks and how it's all terrible and how I've never been listened to, but then start working to change that opinion. That's the big thing. For researchers, for staff like that, actions matter. What if you follow up, if you come back, if you start to help them, even if you leave that first conversation and it's like, oh man, they still hate me, they hate us, they hate central IT, all that sort of thing. If you start to follow up, if you're persistent, if you're persistently helpful with them, eventually you will change that. And you may only change it for you. They may like you and hate everybody else, but that's okay. That's the first step, and you can start introducing them to the rest of the team and get them down that road, which is incredibly important. Now, I will say that grad students are a lot easier because they don't have many preconceived notions. They've only been there for a little while, so they're easier to deal with. But when you're dealing with those full professors and staff and stuff like that, that's much harder to do. The most important thing is let it go on your side and acknowledge it exists on the other side, and then start dealing with it.
Dave, you had a
I
comment?
think that kind of speaks a little bit towards my love of research versus
Yeah, the difference, I think, between the amount of interaction that we have with researchers versus what the enterprise side has with not just researchers, but the entire, call it customer base, is very different. There's an analogy here, I think, that derives from NVIDIA's entree into the research computing world with CUDA and such technologies, where prior to that, I suspect that almost none of their employees interacted with end users because they were selling their product to retailers who then resold the product to the end users. And even the retailers were not having much interaction with the end users once the purchase was executed. And then suddenly they get into the research computing business. They're having to work with faculty to get them teaching the technology. They're having to work with research teams in order to get the researchers to adopt the technology. And I have to say, I think there are very few organizations that could have managed such an extreme transition well. But it seems like it's worked out. Good. So Susan and Zoe and Sandra.
Yeah, I think in general, just acknowledging that they exist, but trying, like, again, who do you have, control over? You. And who's going to have to deal with then the next person, the next department? You. So, yeah, I guess everything said so far.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, and I think there's a certain personality type that does well in this context, and it's I can let it roll over me. It's okay if they're mad at me, because if they're mad at me, I can work with them and we can make them less mad. But if they're mad at someone else, that person might actually respond in a way that's going to escalate it. Yeah, Richard.
Yes, it's very connected.
one of the ways that I've typically dealt with it, this is on enterprise IT right now, I'm literally putting together quotes for one of my research departments on campus. And right now I'm dealing with an aggressive situation where they're up against the USDA grant deadline. And I'm trying to work with vendors to get them what they need. And I walked into this with them having preconceived notions of the IT department is always difficult to do.
Right.
So what I have done, and this is a relevant conversation because I'm dealing with it at this very moment, is I am going out of my way to tackle that preconceived notion and get to the root of it and dispel it. Well, through my own targeted influence on this one situation, I'm rectifying the preconceived notion for the whole IT department by going above and beyond.
And there's a ripple effect, because the thing that I think we often forget is that they all talk to each other, and particularly faculty, because faculty don't just talk to the colleagues in their own department. That's certainly true, but that's not the limit of it. They're on committees, they go to, a party at the president's house. They meet people from every department on campus. And if they love you, they're the perfect person to sell you to others. And if they hate you, they will not hesitate to pour poison in everybody's ear.
And the other thing is, I think we can, if we are very clear about managing expectations, what we can deliver and how much time we have. And it's better to tell someone at the beginning, like, oh, if it's time for this, I can come back in 3 weeks and do this. But if you need it this week, I'm just too, I don't have time for it left.
And
I would like to do it, but,
A workshop right now. And I was like, I don't know how much I can help you, but let me see what I can do. And then started targeting that, setting that expectation. Okay, I am in the middle of something else, but let me see what I can do for you right now. And so far the response has been positive.
Well, and they certainly, I think researchers certainly do understand I'm on travel for university business because they do that all the time. So
taking ownership is very important.
They want to know that they can rely on you. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Jerry, you may be the last comment because we're 1 minute over.
What I do, my user, I don't go to them very often, but they'll walk into the office and I hear this tap on the door and I drop what I'm doing and the first thing I say is, what can I do for you? I no longer have a schedule of what I'm going to do for today, a task list, because everything becomes a top priority, at least for the next 15 minutes. But Sandra's correct. I set expectations. No, I've got another thing ahead of you right now that I have to complete, and I don't necessarily tell them that if I don't complete it, I will die or I won't remember to go back to it. But yeah, I will get to yours as soon as that one's over. I estimate I will be on yours tomorrow.
Yeah, and then this goes back to the excuse me, the follow-up question. Then they want to hear the action report. Where is their thing? They want to hear back from you. This is the progress I've made so far. This is how much more time I expect it to take. And I think we're going to have to wrap up because we've come to the end of our time. So I want to give a big thank you to all of our panelists. This conversation is easily the one that could have gone on longest if we had that luxury. And we can tell that again from the more than 50 comments on question number 2 in the chat. But I'm very proud of us that we got through 4 of our 9 questions. So I think we can all pat ourselves on the back. Our next session is coming up at, I better look this up. Our next session starts at 10:45, so we have about 25 minutes. It's working effectively with system-facing professionals, and Dave is a system-facing professional who will be moderating, so everybody has to say nice things about system-facing professionals during the panel. But Dave and Sean and Scott and Mike will be our panelists. It's going to be fantastic. They also have, I think you guys have put together a bunch of questions as well. Is that correct? Yeah. So you don't count on getting through all of them. That's our experience so far. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop recording. We'll leave the session live, we will come back in about 25 minutes.